Hi, and welcome to J Walitalo Woodburning. Today we're going to do a wood burning of bunnies. So the first thing I'll show you is two different ways to transfer your image onto the wood. The first method is an interesting method of tracing. And because a lot of times your wood is not the standard size piece of paper, one of the tricks, rather than trying to resize a photo and print it out for tracing, that I use is to zoom in on the picture that you choose on your computer to get it about the same size as the piece of wood that you're using, or at least so that the image is about the same size as how you want it to appear on your piece of wood. And then you can put a piece of paper on the screen of your computer, turn the lights off, and just trace around, because the active light will go through the paper and you can see to trace. Once you have the image traced onto a piece of paper, then you can transfer it by tracing over again on the piece of paper with a piece of transfer paper or carbon paper behind it onto your wood. So that's a really fun little trick that you can use for helping you transfer and resize images directly from the computer onto your piece of wood without having to print off multiple different copies trying to resize it to get it to the right size. I tend to prefer not to trace personally. I like to do things freehand. So I just wanted to show you that little trick because I know that a lot of people do tend to trace, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. As you can see, the traced image is nothing like the final wood burning. It still takes a lot of skill and practice to become a good artist, even if you use tricks and techniques like tracing. The piece of wood I'm using is a scrap piece of wood, scrap material from a different project. It has a very large knot fairly close to the center, and so I tend to set these pieces aside when they have large knot holes in them. They don't work well for doing things like people portraits where you'd have a face right there and then the knot hole becomes a blemish. But I do try to figure out images that will work well with the wood. And here we can just basically ignore the knot hole. We place the focal points, the rabbit's faces, below the knot hole on the wood, and then the knot hole just kind of becomes part of the background. You can see that I'm using the tip of the wood burner, and I'm moving fairly quickly. This video has been sped up, so it is twice as fast as what it would be in real life. Don't get impatient. Take your time. When you want to burn darker, you just go slower. Don't press hard on the wood burner. That can hurt the tips of the wood burner. I'm using the standard chisel tip here. It's one of the most versatile tips. And I'm just pulling up a little bit, making lines to indicate the hair. I also am doing darker shading behind on the rabbit that's behind, and doing lighter shading on the rabbit that's closer up. That gives you a sense of perspective or depth. And you can see I move back and forth between using the point of the wood burner and the heel of the wood burner. I also will use the straight edge to get very straight lines or hard edges, like around the ear. And then I can also use the side of the wood burner to pull out and create shading. And as I pull out, I go a little bit slower at the beginning to have the sharp edge, and then I pull out a little bit faster to get it to fade out from the edge. Personally, when I'm doing wood burning, if there's an animal or a person, I tend to start with the eyes and work my way out. But that's personal preference. There's no right or wrong. And here you can see I'm doing more of the fur, and again, doing a hard edge and pulling the shading out from that hard edge to create some depth effect between the rabbits. You can also note that the rabbits are what would be considered in the middle ground of the artwork. Many pieces of artwork have foreground, middle ground, and background, 3 different visual components. The middle ground tends to be in the middle. The background tends to be behind and tends to be less detailed than the middle ground. The middle ground is typically your focal point. And then the foreground is anything that's closer up. So in this depiction, I've added flowers up in the foreground. Another component to this particular image, I'm not following precisely the image that I used as a reference picture from online. That was from free online reference pictures, Creative Commons. And you always want to use Creative Commons or make sure that you have permission to use the pictures, that they're not copyright. That's for a different video though, getting into copyright. I am not a copyright lawyer. I do know enough to be careful, so I recommend that you always try to use Creative Commons reference photos or your own reference photos. This particular image, I'm also trying to capture different aspects of the carbon cycle. And so in the background, you can kind of see in pencil, I've drawn out wood planks for a wall in the background. The bunnies are kind of in a doorway. And the wood planks represent carbon storage. Wood is primarily made out of carbon, and having wooden structures helps sequester or capture carbon in a long-term storage way where it's not decomposing and being released back out into the atmosphere. The bunnies do release carbon through respiration. All living things release carbon through respiration. And that's partly also depicted in one of the bunnies eating a plant. And then the flowers up in the foreground help represent carbon sequestering or carbon capture, because plants are the primary source of capturing carbon from the atmosphere and locking it up in a way that we can get it out of the atmosphere and turn it into plant matter, whether it's grasses or forbs, flowers, trees. And trees and woody plant material tends to capture carbon in a much more long-term manner than grasses, but they all do help capture carbon and lock it up out of the atmosphere. So here I'm going back and doing some of the detailed work of adding the flower, the little plant that the bunny is eating. And you can see I'm using the very tip of the chisel tip to get more, I'm using it more like a pencil to get the very detailed petals of the flower. And then come in and work on the foreground and depict the flowers in the foreground. And for the flowers, I did not use any reference picture. I just sketched them out as cute little flowers. Probably daisies, but they're fairly generic little flowers. And you can be creative with this. You don't always have to follow your reference picture. You can combine different pictures, do things out of your imagination. So here you can very clearly see how I'm using the side of the wood burner. I'm holding it at about a 45-degree angle with the flat surface on the wood and dragging it across to darken a large area all at once. This does tend to work easier if you go with the grain of the wood. If you go against the grain of the wood, then you tend to get little bumps as you go over the rings, the early wood versus late wood, where it burns not quite as evenly. I'll do the edge of the doorway, going with the flat edge to create a hard edge where the doorway is. This also kind of helps frame in the picture a little bit. I'm going to leave the very edges unburnt, so that the only thing that kind of comes up from the frame are the flowers in the foreground, but it kind of frames in the picture a little bit, creates a little bit more dynamic. Again, working very, very slowly. Remember, this video is double speed, so it does take time to burn, and I'm using the very tip of the wood burner for the flower petals, and then there I rocked it on the edge, on the straight edge, to make the stem of the flower. And I'm not terribly worried about being too detailed on the background. Again, the background is basically giving you a sense of place. But typically the background is not as detailed as your focal point. And so I'm just kind of giving an indication of wood paneling in the background. So I want some lighter stripes where the pieces of wood come together. There might be cracks in it, but I'm not going extremely detailed into the background. Just trying to give a feel and help the rabbits stand out, because the rabbits are burnt fairly lightly. They're not very dark, so if I burn dark around behind them, it will really help make them pop out in the picture and draw your attention to them. And I also get bored, doing just a flat background takes quite a bit of time, so I'll jump back and forth and work on the flowers in the foreground a little bit, and then go back to the background again. So the challenge with this particular activity is to try to capture the 3 different aspects of the carbon cycle: carbon storage, carbon capture, and carbon release, and capture the 3 different planes of view artistically in one image. So the foreground, background, and middle ground. And then incorporate one of each of the parts of the carbon cycle into each plane of view. You can mix this up in many different ways. You can depict it in many different ways. Here I chose to depict it in a way that was fairly cute and not very controversial, but there are very different ways that you could depict this concept and this idea of the carbon cycle and the different parts of the carbon cycle into a piece of art. So you can remember that gasoline-powered cars release carbon, and many industries release carbon as a byproduct. But all animals do release carbon through respiration. There's different ways to sequester carbon too. There are some forms of technology that will help capture carbon from smokestacks. There's different ways that you can depict that. You can also store carbon in things like cement cinder blocks. There's some companies that actually do specifically put excess carbon in cinder blocks as a form of long-term storage. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be wood or animals. You can think about this concept of the carbon cycle and come up with many different examples of how to portray it. Here, the tip of my wood burner became loose and started to wiggle. I stopped the video, so you didn't quite see everything. It took about 5 minutes for the tip to cool down, and then I tightened it back up before turning it back on. You always want to turn it off before you tighten a tip, but they will become loose occasionally. And primarily just remember, you don't have to press down hard. If you're pressing down hard while you're burning, you're much more likely to loosen the tip on it. But even when you're not pressing down hard, sometimes the tip will become loose. And you want to turn the wood burner off before you tighten the tip, because when it's hot, it's more likely to break. The metal is more malleable. It's also more likely that the lines, the grip lines on the pliers, will indent the tip of the wood burner and make it uneven, which is really a pain to work with afterwards. Then you get little lines and burrs that dig into the wood when you're trying to get an even burn. So I turned the wood burner off, tightened the tip, and then turned it back on and let it heat back up. And now I'm done with the doorway, and I'm done with the wood paneling door in the background, and I'm just burning a very, very dark silhouette of a doorway behind them. Again, using the straight edge to get a very straight line, and then coming back and using the flat edge to burn a large area all at once. And this does take quite a bit more time than what it's showing in the video. The video is sped up. So you don't have to press hard, just take your time to get a dark burn. And you'll also notice I completely jumped over and skipped burning across the knot hole, or the knot. When it's all done, that knot, once it's polyurethaned, will darken up, and you'll get a little bit of detail from the ears, but it will darken up and blend right into the wood paneling that we burned. Final step is to sign and put the date on it, and turn the wood burner off. Very important part to remember. So now we have a very cute little wood burning of bunnies, I go back through and erase my pencil marks from where I sketched it out. And there you go. I hope you enjoy, and please post pictures of what you create in the comments section. Thank you.